Hello and welcome back. Today is Wednesday, December 18th, 2024, and we are reading chapter 42 of Lirael by Garth Nix today. And we've got 2 chapters and the epilogue left. That's it. We are almost finished with Lirael. So thank you so much for everyone who's been sticking around and listening to this every day. I've had a lot of fun reading, and this is going to be a really exciting chapter, and my throat feels much better today, but it's a little raspy, and I'm going to get right into reading before it goes out. I don't want my voice to start cracking before the end of the chapter, so let's get started. Chapter 42, Southerlings and a Necromancer. The sun was setting, sending a red light across the broad river. Despite Sam and Lirael's earlier weather spell, the wind had turned and was blowing strongly from the south. Even against the wind, Finder continued to make good time, tacking in long diagonals between the eastern and western shores. As Lirael had expected, Sam hadn't been able to stop himself asking questions. But even with the interruptions, she had managed to create the charter skin of a barking owl and fold it up properly for later use. "That was fascinating," said Sam. "I'd like to learn how to make one myself." "I've left in the skin of a lion back at the glacier," replied Lirael, "but you can have it if you ever go there. It belongs to the library, but I expect you'd be allowed to borrow it." Sam nodded. The prospect of him visiting the Claire's glacier seemed exceedingly remote. It was just another piece of a future that he couldn't imagine. All he could think of was reaching the safe haven of the house. "Can we sail through the night?" he asked. "Yes," replied Lirael, "if the dog is prepared to stay up as lookout to help find her." "I will," barked the disreputable dog. She had not shifted from her position at the bow. "The sooner we're there, the better. There's a foul scent on this wind, and the river is too deserted to be normal." Sam and Lirael both looked around. They'd been so intent on the charter skin that they hadn't noticed the complete absence of any other boats, though there were a number anchored close to the eastern shore. "No one's followed us down from High Bridge, and we have passed only 4 craft coming from the south," said the dog. "This cannot be normal for the Radarlin." "No," Sam agreed. "Whenever I've been on the river, there have always been lots of boats, even in winter. We should have seen some of the wood barges at least, heading north." "I haven't seen a single craft all day," said the dog, "which means that they've stopped somewhere to take shelter. And the boats I've seen tied up have all been out on the jetties or moored to buoys, as far as they can get from the land." "There must be more of the dead, or those free magic constructs, all along the river," said Lirael. "I knew Mother and Dad shouldn't have gone," said Sam. "If they'd known—" "They would still have gone," interrupted Mogget with a yawn. He stretched and tasted the air with his delicate pink tongue. "As per usual, trouble comes in several directions at once. I think some is coming our way, for I am afraid to say that the hound is correct. There is a reek on this breeze. Wake me if something unpleasant seems likely to occur." With that, he settled back down again, curling into a tight white ball. "I wonder what Mogget would call something unpleasant," muttered Sam nervously. He picked up his sword and drew it partially out of the scabbard, checking that the charter marks he'd put there still flourished. The dog sniffed the air again as the boat came about onto a port tack. Her nose quivered, and she raised her snout higher as the scent grew stronger. "Free magic," she said finally, "on the western shore." "Where exactly?" asked Lirael, shading her eyes with her hand. It was hard to see anything to the west against the setting sun. All she could make out was tangled groves of willows between empty fields, a few makeshift jetties, and the semi-submerged stone walls of a large fish trap. "I can't see," replied the dog. "I can only smell, somewhere downstream." "I can't see anything either," added Sam. "But if the free magic isn't on the river, we can just sail past." "I can smell people, too," reported the dog. "Frightened people." Sam didn't say anything. Lirael glanced at him and saw that he was biting his lip. "Could it be the Necromancer?" Lirael asked. "Hedge?" The dog shrugged. I cannot tell from here. The scent of free magic is strong, so it could be a necromancer, or perhaps a Stilkin or a Hish. Lirael swallowed nervously. She could bind a Stilkin, since she had Nehema to help, and Sam, the dog, and Mogget, but she didn't want to have to. I knew I should have read that book, muttered Sam. He didn't say which book. They sat in silence for a minute, as Finder continued on her way towards the western shore. The sun was sinking fast now, more than half of its ruddy disk below the horizon. The stars were starting to become brighter as darkness fell. I suppose we'd better take a look, Sam said at last, with obvious effort. He buckled on his sword, but made no move to pick up the bandolier of bells. Lirael looked at them and wished she could take them up, but they were not hers. It was up to Sam to decide what to do with them. If we tie up at the next jetty, will we be close? Lirael asked the dog. The hound nodded her head. Without needing others, Finder turned towards the jetty. Wake up, Mogget, said Sam, but he spoke softly. It had grown quiet on the river with the fall of night. He did not want his voice to carry over the soft burble of the current. Mogget did not stir. Sam spoke again and scratched the cat's head, but Mogget continued to sleep. He'll wake when he needs to, said the dog. She also spoke softly. Prepare yourselves. Finder expertly slid up to the jetty as Lirael lowered the sail. Sam jumped ashore, his sword drawn, closely followed by the dog. Lirael joined them a moment later, Nehema bare, the charter marks on the blade glowing in the twilight. The dog sniffed the air again and cocked one ear. All three stood still, listening, waiting. Even the hungry gulls had stopped calling. There was no sound save their own breathing and the rush of the river under the jetty. Off in the distance, the silence was suddenly broken by a long, drawn-out scream. Then, as if that were a signal for noise to begin, it was followed by muffled shouts and more screams. At the same time, Lirael and Sam both felt several people die. Though it was far away, they flinched at the shock of the deaths, and then again as it was quickly repeated. There was something else there, too, that they could sense. Some power over death. "A necromancer!" blurted Sam. He took a step back. "The bells," said Lirael, and she looked down at the boat. Mogget was awake now, his green eyes gleaming in the dark. He was perched upon the bell bandolier. "They're coming this way," announced the dog calmly. The shouts and screams grew closer, but Lirael and Sam still couldn't see anything beyond the line of willows. Then, 50 yards downstream, a man burst out of the trees and fell into the water. He went under at once, but bobbed to the surface some distance out. He swam for a few strokes, then turned on his back to float, too weary or too hurt to keep swimming. Behind him, a burnt and blackening corpse shambled to the water's edge and let out a horrible, gobbling cry as it saw its prey escape. Repelled by the swift flow of the river, the dead hand staggered back into the trees. "Come on," said Lirael, though she could barely get out the words. She drew her panpipes and marched off. The dog followed her. Sam hesitated, staring out into the darkness. More people screamed and shouted beyond the trees. No words were clear, but Sam knew they were desperately afraid, and the shouts were for help. He looked back at the bells. Mogget met his gaze, unblinking. "What are you waiting for?" asked the cat. "My permission?" Sam shook his head. He felt paralyzed, unable to reach for the bells or to follow Lirael. She and the dog were almost at the end of the jetty. He could sense the dead nearby, less than 100 yards away, and the necromancer with them. He had to do something. He had to act. He had to prove to himself he wasn't a coward. "I don't need the bells!" he shouted, and he ran down the jetty, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. He burst past the surprised Lirael and the dog, and sprinted through the gap where the willows had been pruned back. He was past the trees in an instant, and out in a twilit paddock. A dead hand rushed at him. He cut its legs away and kicked it over, all in one fluid motion. Before it could rise, he jumped over it and ran on. The necromancer. He had to kill the necromancer before he could drag him into death. He had to kill him as quickly as he could. A hot rage rose in him, banishing the fear. Sam growled and ran on. Lirael and the dog emerged from the willows to see Sam charge. The dead hand he'd cut down scrabbled towards them, but Lirael had the panpipes ready at her lips. She chose Sereneth and blew a strong, pure note, its commanding tone stopping the hand in its tracks. Without a pause, Lirael changed to Gibbeth, and a trill of dancing notes sent the corpse somersaulting backwards, even as the spirit inhabiting it was forced to walk back into death. "It's gone," said the dog, loping forward. Lirael ran too, but not with Sam's reckless abandon. It was still light enough to see that 30 or 40 dead hands had surrounded a group of men, women, and children. Obviously, they'd tried to reach the safety of the river, only to fail at the very last. Now they had formed a ring, with the children at the center, a last desperate defense. Lirael could sense the dead hands, and something else, something strange and much more powerful. It was only when she saw Sam charge past the hands and scream a challenge that she realized that it had to be the necromancer. The people were screaming too, and shouting, and crying. The dead roared and screeched back as they pulled their victims down and ripped their throats out or rent them limb from limb. Makeshift clubs and sharpened branches struck at the dead, but their wielders did not know how to use them to best effect, and they were heavily outnumbered. Lirael looked across and saw the necromancer turn to face Sam. He raised his hands, and the hot metal smell of free magic suddenly filled the air. A moment later, a blinding, blue-white spark exploded out, leaping across to strike the charging boy. At the same time, the dead hands howled in triumph as they burst through the ranks of struggling men and women and into the inner circle of children. Lirael turned her easy run into an all-out sprint. Whoever she tried to help, it looked like she would be too late. Sam saw the necromancer raise his hands and saw the bronze of his face. Even as he threw himself to the side, his mind raced. A bronze face! And this wasn't Hedge, but Clore of the Mask, the creature his mother had fought years ago. The bolt sizzled past him, missing him by a few inches. Heat from its passage struck him, and the grass behind him burst into flame. Sam slowed down as he reached into the charter and pulled out 4 marks. He drew them with his free hand, fingers flashing too quickly to follow. A triangular silver blade suddenly materialized in his grip. Before it was even fully formed, Sam threw it. The blade spun as it shot through the air. Clore easily ducked it, but the spinning blade turned a few paces beyond her and came shooting back. Sam rushed forward as the blade struck the necromancer in the arm. He expected it to almost sever that limb, but there were only a burst of golden flame, a gout of white sparks, and a smoldering sleeve. "Fool," said Clore, raising her sword. Her voice crawled across his skin like 1,000 tiny insects. Her breath stank of death and free magic. "You have no bells." In that instant, Sam realized that Clore didn't have any bells either, nor were there any human eyes behind the mask. Pools of fire burnt there, and white smoke puffed from the mouth hole. Clore was no longer a necromancer. She was one of the greater dead. Sabriel had finished her as a living being, but someone had brought her back. "Run!" shouted Lirael. "Run!" She stood between the last 4 survivors and those dead hands who had resisted the panpipes. Lirael had blown on Sereneth till her face was blue, but there had just been too many of them for her to deal with, the power of the pipes too slight. The dead who were left didn't seem affected at all. Worse still, the children wouldn't run. They were too shocked, incapable of doing anything, let alone understand what Lirael was shouting at them. A dead hand lunged, and Lirael thrust at it. The dog leapt at another, knocking it down. But a third, a low, loping thing with elongated jaws, got past them. It rushed at a small boy who could not stop screaming. The jaws closed, and the scream was instantly cut off. Sobbing with fury and revulsion, Lirael spun around and hewed off the thing's head, Nehema showering silver sparks as it cut through. But even then, the dead hand functioned, the spirit inside indifferent to any physical harm. She cut at it again and again, but dead fingers still clutched its victim, and the head still gnashed its teeth. Sam parried another blow from the thing that had once been Clore. Her strength was incredible, and once again he nearly lost his sword. His hand and wrist were numb, and the charter marks he'd spelled so laboriously into the blade were slowly being destroyed by Clore's power. When they were gone, the blade would shatter. He staggered back and glanced quickly around the field. He could just make out Lirael and the dog, fighting with at least a half-dozen dead hands. He'd heard the pipes before, the voices of Sereneth and Kibbeth, though strangely different from the bells he knew. They had sent most of the spirits animating the hands back into death, but had had no effect upon Clore. Clore struck again, hissing. Sam dodged. Desperately, he tried to think of what he could do. There had to be some spell, something that would at least hold her back long enough for him to get away. Lirael and the dog struck together, smashing the last dead hand to the ground. Before it could get up, the dog barked in its face. Instantly, it went limp. No more than a ghastly, misshapen corpse, the spirit vanished. "Thanks," gasped Lirael. She looked around her, at the grotesque forms of dead hands and the pathetic bodies of their victims. Desperately, she hoped to see even just one of the children, but there was no one standing except her and the dog. There were bodies everywhere, sprawled on the blood-soaked ground. The cast-off remnants of the dead hands piled up with the slaughtered people. Lirael closed her eyes, her sense of death almost overpowering her. That sense confirmed what her eyes had already told her. No one had survived. She felt sick, the gorge rising in her throat. But as she bent forward to throw up, she suddenly heard Sam shouting. She straightened up, opened her eyes, and looked around. She couldn't see Sam, but off in the distance there was a blaze of golden fire, interspersed with huge showers of white sparks. It might have been a fireworks display, but Lirael knew better. Even so, it took her a few seconds to work out what Sam was shouting. When it finally percolated into her stunned, shocked mind, all thought of throwing up disappeared. She jumped over the bodies of the dead hands and their victims and started to run. Sam was shouting, "Help! Lirael! Dog! Morget! Anyone! Help!" Sam's sword had broken on the last exchange of blows. It had snapped off near the hilt, leaving him with a useless dead weight devoid of magic. Clore laughed, a laugh strange and distant behind her mask, as if it echoed from inside some far-off hall. She had grown taller as she had stalked after Sam, visibly a thing of darkness under the rotting, splitting furs. Now she stood head and shoulders above him, white smoke drifting from her mouth as she raised her sword again. Red fire flowed along the blade, and flaming drops fell to the grass. Sam threw the hilt at her face and jumped back, shouting, "Help! Lirael! Dog!" The sword came down. Clore leapt forward as well, faster and farther than Sam had expected. The blade whisked past his nose. Shocked, he shouted again, "Morget! Anyone! Help!" Lirael saw the necromancer's sword of red fire come blazing down. Sam fell under the blow, and the red fire obscured Lirael's vision. "Sam!" she screamed. As she screamed, the disreputable dog sprang ahead, leaping in great bounds toward Sam and the necromancer. For a panicked second, Lirael thought Sam had been killed. Then she saw him roll aside, untouched. The necromancer raised her sword again, and Lirael burst her lungs trying to get there in time to do something. But she could not. She was still 40 or 50 yards away, and her mind was empty of all the spells that might have crossed the distance and distracted the enemy. "Die," whispered Clore, raising her sword two-handed above her head, the blade pointing straight down. Sam looked up at it and knew he could not get out of the way in time. She was too fast, too strong. He half raised his hand and tried to speak a charter mark, but the only one that came to mind was something useless, some mark used in making his toys. The blade came down. Sam screamed. The disreputable dog barked. There was charter magic in the bark. It hit Clore as she struck. Her arms flashed gold and sizzled, white smoke gouting out of 1,000 tiny holes. The blow that should have impaled Sam went awry, the sword sinking deep into the earth, so close that his hip was burnt by the flame. All Clore's unnatural strength had gone into the blow. Now she struggled to free the weapon as the dog advanced upon her, growling. The hound had grown and was now the size of a desert lion, with teeth and claws to match. Her collar shone with golden fire, the charter marks shifting and joining in a wild dance. The dead creature let the sword go and backed away. Sam struggled to his feet as Clore drew back. He clenched his fist as he tried to calm himself in preparation for casting a spell. Lirael arrived a second later, completely out of breath. Gasping, she slowed to a walk and moved up behind the dog. Clore raised one shadowy fist, her fingernails elongating into thin blades of darkness. White smoke still eddied around her, but the holes in her arm had already closed. She took one step forward, and the dog barked again. There was free magic power in this bark, reinforced with charter spells. Her collar shone even brighter, and Sam and Lirael had to half close their eyes. Clore flinched and raised her hand to shield her face. More white smoke poured out from behind her mask, and her body changed shape under the furs. She began to collapse in on herself, her clothes crumpling as the shadow flesh within leaked away. "Curse you!" she shrieked. The furs fell to the ground, and the bronze mask bounced on top of them. A shadow as dark and thick as ink flowed away from the dog and Lirael, moving faster than any liquid ever spilled. Lirael started to follow, but the dog blocked her way. "No," said the dog. "Let it go. I've only forced it out of its shape. It is too powerful for me to send back into death alone, or destroy." "It was Clore," said Sam, white-faced and shivering. "Clore of the mask, a necromancer my mother fought years ago." "It is one of the greater dead now," said Mogget, "back from beyond the 7th or 8th gate." Sam jumped several feet into the air. When he looked down, Mogget was sitting quite calmly near Clore's sword, as if he'd been there all the time. "Where were you?" Sam asked. "I've been looking around while you took care of things here," explained Mogget. "Clore has fled, but will return. There are more dead hands less than 2 leagues to the west. 100 of them at least, with shadow hands to lead them." 100! exclaimed Sam, as Lirael said, "Shadow hands!" "We'd better get back to the boat," said Sam. He looked at Clore's sword, quivering in the earth. No flames ran down it now, but the steel was dark as ebony and etched with strange runes that wriggled and convulsed and made him feel nauseated. "We should destroy this," he said. His head felt strangely fuzzy, and he found it difficult to think. But I don't know how to do it quickly." "What about all these people?" asked Lirael. She couldn't call them bodies. She still couldn't believe they were all dead. It had simply happened so quickly, in just a few frenzied minutes. Sam looked across the field. There were more stars out now, and a slim crescent of a moon had risen. In the cool light, he saw that many of the slain people wore blue hats or scarves. A scrap of blue material was caught in the claws of one of the dead that Lirael had banished with her pipes. "They're Southerlings," he said, surprised. He walked over for a closer look at the nearest body, a fair-haired boy who couldn't have been more than 16. Sam's eyes showed more puzzlement than fear, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "Southerling refugees. I guess they were trying to escape." "Escape from what?" asked Lirael. Before anyone could answer, a dead creature howled in the distance. A moment later, the howl was taken up by many desiccated, decaying throats. "Clore has reached the hands," said Mogget urgently. "We must leave now." The cat hurried away. Sam started to follow, but Lirael grabbed him by the arm. "We can't just leave," protested Lirael. "If we leave them, their bodies will get used." "We can't stay," protested Sam. "You heard Mogget. There are too many to fight, and Clore will come back too." "We have to do something," Lirael said. She looked at the dog. Surely the dog would help her. They had to perform the cleansing rite on the bodies, or bind them so they couldn't be used to house spirits brought from death. But the dog shook her head. "There's no time," she said sadly. "Sam can get the bells," protested Lirael. "We have to—" The hound nudged Lirael behind the knee, pushing her on. The girl stumbled forward, tears welling up in her eyes. Sam and Mogget were already well ahead, hurrying towards the willows. "Hurry," said the dog anxiously, after a glance over her shoulder. She could hear the clicking of many bones and smell decaying flesh. The dead were closing fast. Lirael wept as she broke into a shambling jog. If only she could run faster, or knew how to use the panpipes better, she might have been able to save even one of the refugees. One of the refugees. One had got away from the dead. "The man!" she exclaimed, breaking into a run. "The man in the river! We have to rescue him!" Ooh, that is the end of chapter 42. Told you that was going to be a good chapter. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm going to go make some tea now and soothe my throat. It's a little sore, but I want to read the next chapter now, but I'm not going to. I'll wait till tomorrow. I will post chapter 43 tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And until then, have a great evening. Take care. And as always, may your magic manifest. Bye.